And I remember at that point that many of them came up to us and said, yeah, you're right. I think your time is done. You guys can go back. I think we've got this. And I remember just telling guys, yeah, you guys have this. And we got on a plane, put all our stuff, and we came back home and started working at Nairobi Chapel.
Okay. So you came back and plugged back into Nairobi Chapel.
Nairobi Chapel, Gracious Church, had been waiting for us. So Bishop Oscar, his
and now
team,
this time it's changed. Has it grown? Is it
it's
4
grown.
years?
Things have changed. I mean, some of the things we began have now become huge. We had begun a youth fellowship at the university called SALT.
You started SALT?
Actually, Carol started SALT. Yeah, Carol was the first person who came up. Yeah.
These are things you only find out
even
here.
came up with the word SALT. I mean, I still remember having our little brainstorming and coming up with serving a living transformer.
What?
I mean, so we came back and it had taken a life of its own. It had really, really grown. We started the youth ministry at Chapel. It had really grown. I mean, we were pioneers of the worship team. Now there were multiple worship teams. So, I mean, the church had been growing in our absence.
In fact, Kaberia talks about how when he was in Daystar, and again, go and watch the Kaberia interview, how for him, he's listening to music and he's listening to this guitar and live recording. And then he flips and he says, oh my God, this is Nairobi Chapel.
Nairobi Chapel. That was us. Yeah.
And then part of the writers of that album were you and Pastor Kiama.
Yes, I was a music writer. I was a songwriter. Actually, before we even went to the States, we had done some of those live recordings.
Which again, what people think is normal now, that was ahead of its time.
It was way ahead of its time. And nobody had done that. Nobody was doing that. I remember the first recording we did. It was called Milele Shukrani. I mean, it was just ahead of its time. And I remember, I mean, I was a songwriter. So I remember we recorded songs. Actually, in the States, I actually even licensed some of those songs to be used in different spaces.
Whoa.
So, I mean, we were really, the church was actually on the cutting edge in some major ways. There was a lady called Massimo here, who God had allowed to become the music director at that time. She was so gifted. And so she really pushed up our standards to a very high level that no church at that point was. And that's why a lot of the young people now are coming. So we came back and found this church really growing. And came back around 2000.
You had understood, not to interject, but I just want to emphasize on the point of you had understood the power of music in teen culture and in youth culture.
Absolutely. Youth culture, sight and sound generation. So it's almost like the packaging is almost as important as the content. You can have great message, but if it's got bad packaging, nobody will buy it. And so just coming back with that understanding now of like, yeah, we have to go all out. In the States, I got to see some churches that were taking some significant risks to reach non-Christians. The church, that group I worked with in Wisconsin, the reason I wanted to work there and do an internship is because the guy who got fired, the guy who I took over from, he was one of the most radical guys I'd ever met. I mean, he was willing to take all risks to reach these unchurched young students. So I think I'd been exposed to some people who are not afraid to take risks. And that became very useful for me later on when we took some risks at Mavuno. Because of course, all these things, you always get backlash. But because you've seen other people doing it, getting backlash, but then understanding why they're doing it, I think that became very helpful. Understanding church history, again, studying church history, beginning to see that with every reformation, every revival, every time God did something crazy, there was always people who took risks.
It was unconventional.
They were always willing to be non-conventional. They always got bashed for it. Some of them got killed for it. But as a result, they were able to help the faith take the leap into the next generation. So coming back and seeing some of those predecessors and understanding what they did. I mean, I remember reading about a guy called Martin Luther. Martin Luther was one of the greatest reformers in the church. And one of the things he did is because the church was speaking Latin. Because everybody thought Latin was a holy language. Because Latin was a language of the Roman Empire, of the Roman Emperor when Constantine accepted Christianity. So all the Bibles were in Latin, the priests spoke Latin. And the guy's like, why? So he's the guy who was pioneering, the Bible has to be translated to German, we have to create German songs, what are these Latin chants? So he went to the bars and he picked the pop songs of the bars. He was a monk, but he picked the pop songs of the bars and he created what we now sing as some of the hymns in church. I was like, this is what these guys did. And so I think understanding that allowed me to come back with a very different sense of, I think we can take risks. I think the gospel in Africa, people think that the gospel is actually a Western creation. It isn't. The gospel actually came out of the Middle East. Jesus looks more like Osama bin Laden than he does Donald Trump.
Yes,
You know?
for sure.
And I mean, for me, it's almost that sense of, no, this gospel is actually even more African than it is Western, because it came to Ethiopia long before it came to Europe. And definitely many more years before it came to America. So understanding those things really gave me a confidence for this is who we have to reach our generation. So I came back with such a joy for that and such a zeal, and really got plugged back into Nairobi Chapel. In another few years.
Oh, and you came back with more. This is so important. And I say this for the sake of the new pastors. You came back with more than just a spiritual feeling that you needed to change. You actually went and got the intellectualness behind it.
Absolutely.
So you're not forming a church, you're not starting a church.
I mean, God has taken some, think about the years I've taken, because I've grown up in a church home. I mean, my dad is actually a pastor. He became a pastor later, which is why I didn't mention it in the earlier part.
Yeah.
But I've grown up really discipled in the church. Then I've had all these years with Pastor Oscar, with Bishop Oscar. And then I've gone to Fuller Seminary and been educated in a sense.
4 years.
But literally before I started Mavuno, it was 13 years since I started working with Pastor Oscar. So I've got a foundation that has helped me develop convictions, which is why I say in this season of your life, going back to seasons, that you want to get a mentor. You know, the season after school is not the season for run out and make a lot of money. That's a season for who are the mentors who are going to mentor me so I can discover purpose. Who are the people who I'm going to stand on their shoulders so I can see far. And so I think that is what, for me, allowed me. I remember when we started Mavuno years later, people would be like, why is this church growing so fast? I'm like, no, you're seeing now. You should be seeing what happened many years. The process that has brought us to this place. Yeah. So.
And I think that's why I love the documentation of this. Even I, who consider myself a Mavuno diehard, didn't know half of these stories.
Yeah.
So the power of telling the story. Yeah. Okay, so you come back to let's continue the story. You come back to Chapel.
Come back to Chapel. Yeah.
Chapel, a lot has changed. What happens next?
So Chapel's changed. Chapel has we go through a process at that point, buy a lot of land. I mean, so Nairobi Chapel is landlocked.
What's your role?
My role right now, because when I went, remember, as a youth pastor, came back as an outreach pastor, pretty much was almost an executive role, because then at that point I was really, between me and Pastor Janet, who had also joined internship at the same time, we were sort of like Pastor Oscar's assistants in a sense. Yeah. But I did a lot of outreach stuff. So I was the one in charge of starting new churches for Nairobi Chapel. I was also in charge of helping people grow in their faith, discipleship. So I got some pretty significant roles. I think there's no job I've never done at Nairobi Chapel. I did everything, you know. I think it's only children's ministry I wasn't involved in, but I was involved in everything.
And let me just say that Chapel, when we're talking about Nairobi Chapel at the time is where Mamlaka was.
It's Mamlaka, That's where the chapel is. Okay. So we find 14 acres of land, Jamhuri, which is now what currently Nairobi Chapel. We do a huge capital campaign, and some of this actually happens when we're away, and buy this land. Then when the land is bought, the government changes. Remember, we come back 2000, 2002, Moi era ends, Kibaki comes in. First thing those guys do is freeze a lot of the land allocations that had happened and purchases. So because especially anything near a forest, they were like, Z. So apparently, in Jamhuri, there used to be some kind of forested area before a lot of the excisions were done. So they're like, you can't even develop that land first. We have to first figure out whether this was actually illegal or whether it was your land. The church has raised 40 million to buy this land.
Then, please
40 million then. It was a huge amount of money. I remember it was so painful raising it. We climbed mountains. I mean, we did a lot of fundraisers to do it. So I remember at that point, guys were so disappointed. What is going on? What's God into? Why would we buy this land and use all this money for the government to stop us? But as the elders prayed, they began to feel something very interesting. And God sometimes works in your disappointment. Remember the story of sometimes the things don't work out the way you want them to, but God has a bigger plan. So what happened actually is that in the process,
it's crazy.
As we prayed, because it took a while to pray. First of all, you're so disappointed you don't even want to pray. And you're like, God, give us our land, give us our land, give us our land. Then you stop praying that way and you're like, okay, God, so what are you saying? You know, after you've stopped demanding and you're like, okay, it's not helping me. So you get to the place now where you say, okay, so what is God saying? So we actually began to ask God, What are you saying to us? And God, the answer he gave to Pastor Oscar and even to the rest of the team was, I never intended for Nairobi Chapel to go into one space. I intended you to multiply and become many churches. And already I've given you what it takes now, not in the future. So do it now. So the thought immediately was, take Nairobi Chapel and multiply it into 5 churches right now. Don't even wait for the day that you'll have more. I've given you the pastors, I've given you the money to do that. So we're like, wow, I mean, how is that? So it was such a crazy idea. And the idea was take the 5 roads that lead into the city and put a significant, the 4 roads, lead so Mombasa Road, Waiyaki Way, Ngong Road, Jogoo Road, put a significant church in each of those and then leave the one in the center. So 1 church multiplies into 5. And so that's a decision we made. We decided, okay, in a year's time, we're actually going to split this church 5 ways and go into 5 different directions. And
It's insane.
it was very insane. Huh? I mean, who does that? And that just tells you the depth of the leadership that this man has, Pastor Oscar, that he's humble enough to do that. So he picked 5 of his leaders, and I was one of them. And he's like, okay, each of you is going to lead one of those churches. So we actually had an opportunity to pick. I was pretty senior among the guys who were picking, so I had a choice where I wanted to go. But I went to school in South B before I went to Langata, so I kind of had a thing for Mombasa Road, and I also wanted to go where there are young people and it's crowded. I like that, so I picked to go there. Everybody had a choice to pick where they were going, and then we picked. Nairobi Chapel at that time had 5 services on a weekend. And so each of us was told
5 services.
Actually, we had reduced because before that we were 7 services. I mean, this is why we had to move. Huh? So and that was again some crazy training, because you can imagine when you were preaching, the month I'd be preaching 5 services on a Sunday, on a weekend. And there's no training like that. I mean, you go through stuff. Malcolm Gladwell talks about your 10,000 hours of just input. I mean, we put in those hours. Huh? And so on one Sunday, I think it was July 25th, we had a service at Nairobi Chapel. We had our last service at Nairobi Chapel. The next Sunday, every church took off. Like all 5 churches were started the same day.
What year is this?
This was in 2005. So we basically had a year to prepare for that move. And here is even the crazier thing. Pastor Oscar took a sabbatical that year and left me and Pastor Janet leading the church. And so we actually are the ones who had to sell the vision to the congregation, challenge them about, and of course you are telling guys you're breaking up the thing that they love.
Yes.
So it was talk about leadership training and growth. We had to sell the vision, get people excited, get people to buy in, get equipment for all the churches. It was quite an ordeal. But I think it was the best leadership training anybody could ever ask for. I would never regret the years under Pastor Oscar. I think they really taught me to be the leader I am today. So one Sunday, we were at Nairobi Chapel. The next Sunday, we were Mavuno.